U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton says U.S.-Israeli relations are not in crisis amid the row over Jewish settlers in occupied East Jerusalem and what she last week called an insult to the United States. With the American military now speaking out, can they tip the balance as the pro-Israel lobby sends a mixed message? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Nick Clark. The US Secretary of State has said the United States has an unshakable and unbreakable bond with Israel. Her statement comes after more than a week of strife between the two allies. Earlier, an Israeli diplomat had described US-Israeli relations at a 35-year low. Last week, Vice President Joe Biden was embarrassed during his visit to Israel when the Israeli government announced plans for 1,600 more settler homes to be built on occupied lands. And tensions have been simmering on the ground in Israel. On Tuesday, clashes erupted in Jerusalem over the reopening of a synagogue nearby the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Both Clinton and Biden had issued strong statements condemning Israel's latest actions and suggested they could inflame tensions further. But Hillary Clinton has said since the US stands by Israel.
We have an absolute commitment to Israel's security. We have a close, unshakable bond between the United States and Israel and between the American-Israeli people. We share common values and a commitment to a democratic future for the world, and we are both committed to a two-state solution. But that doesn't mean that we're going to agree. We don't agree with any of our international partners on everything. And with respect to the announcement that occurred when the Vice President was there, we've expressed our dismay and disappointment. We have, as I said earlier, engaged in consultations with our partners in the peace effort, the Israelis and the Palestinians, about the way forward.
Well, the U.S. has a compelling reason to resolve the Middle East issue. As one of its top military commanders, General David Petraeus, pointed out, its troops. As the head of U.S. Central Command, or the CENTCOM, Petraeus looks over all American operations in the Middle East and Central Asia, except Israel and the Palestinian territories. They currently fall under the watch of the U.S. European Command. Well, on Tuesday, Petraeus told the Senate Armed Services Committee that the conflict has put American credibility and its troops on the line. Concerned that al-Qaeda and other groups may exploit Arab anger over the issue, he said the conflict foments anti-American sentiment due to a perception of US favoritism for Israel. Clearly, the tensions, the issues and so forth have an enormous effect. They set the strategic context within which we operate. Well, pretty strong words there and plenty to discuss. And join us to talk about it further from New York, we have Daniel Levy, a senior fellow and co-director of the Middle East Task Force at the New America Foundation. Professor Ezzedine Shukri Fisher joins us from Cairo. He's a professor of international politics at the American University there. And in Washington, D.C., Scott Carpenter joins us from the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Professor Fisher, if I could start with you first. It's got a point, hasn't he, General Petraeus, the US stance on Israel making life pretty difficult, pretty tough out in the field for its soldiers and commanders. What do you think?
Well, he's got a point, of course, and it is not only making life difficult for American soldiers, it is making life difficult for Americans in general. It is making life difficult for the image of America and, in fact, for all moderates in the region. I'm glad General Petraeus discovered this now, but in fact it has been said, written and repeated over the last 4 or 5 decades. One major source of anti-Americanism in the Middle East is the US, I would say, complicity with Israel throughout this Arab-Israeli conflict. It is just interesting that now the military leadership is picking up on this. But yes, it is. And not only, again, not only American lives in Afghanistan, Iraq, and elsewhere, but mainly American interest in general and the interest of all those who are allied with the US or even perceived as being friendly with the US.
Okay, let's bring in Scott Carpenter. It's true to say that al-Qaeda routinely uses the US support for Israel in its propaganda, doesn't it?
It does, of course, but let's not forget that that was not the original argument that bin Laden made. Bin Laden claimed that the United States occupation of the land of the two holy mosques were the major issue, and at the time that he made his first statements in '96, the Palestinian-Israeli issue was something like 7th on the list after Bosnia. So it is a part of the narrative of al-Qaeda, but it is not the sole aspect of al-Qaeda's rhetoric. And by the way, it's not just the Palestinian-Israeli conflict or the Arab-Israeli conflict, it's the notion that Israel exists at all. So we have to be careful, I think, when we begin to talk about what would change al-Qaeda's mind in terms of shaping the strategic context, as I think General Petraeus discussed.
But do you,
frankly, think
overall,
that
do you agree with General Petraeus's sentiment?
I agree that that resolving the conflict would help enormously in a variety of ways. But do I see it as framing the strategic context for U.S. power in the region? No, not at all. There are lots of other things that I say are much more important in terms of our strategic national interests in the region. Stabilizing Afghanistan, confronting Iran's drive for nuclear weapons, continuing to support Iraqi democracy, keeping Yemen from falling apart, trying to do something in the Horn of Africa, resolving the Western Sahara issue, helping governments in the region continue to broaden and deepen economic reform, and continuing to work with the Saudis and others on a whole range of issues that are of concern to the region. So I think that General Petraeus's comments yesterday in the hearing were not news in a way. I mean, as Professor Shakir said, we have known this for a long time. The whole drive for establishing peace in the region, both even in the later in the Bush administration, that drive was there as a response to pressure from Arab governments who said, look, if you want us to confront Iran, we need to do more or be seen to be doing more on the Palestinian issue. But even so, I've never experienced in my time at the State Department any government not doing something in its national interest because of this issue. Okay. In fact, I would say that every time we've asked them to do anything that was consistent with their national interest, they did it. Okay, yeah, let's bring in Daniel Levy. This is not news. We've known all this for a long time.
Indeed, we've known all this. I think and by the way, General Petraeus said something similar in testimony a year ago. I think what was significant in his comments to the Senate committee was the timing of this while we are in the midst of one of these episodic crises between Israel and the US. I don't think anyone would credibly make the argument that if you got a resolution on the Israeli-Palestinian front, then the entire Middle East would forget all its other problems and that this is a panacea for everything. I also, though, don't think it's credible to argue that this does not lie on a key strategic fault line, and that was the point that the general was making, that this impacts everything else. The unresolved crisis in the Western Sahara does not frame how America is viewed in the region. So, first of all, Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda sympathizers and wannabes are not going to be satisfied if you got a, for instance, dignified two-state dispensation, if the daily ugliness of the conflict were resolved, if you no longer had settlement issues to worry about, they wouldn't be satisfied. But I think the point that the general and others are making is that they could no longer use this issue as a rallying cry, that this issue would no longer have the powerful resonance that it has today, because people would no longer be treated, in inverted commas, to seeing the images of daily Palestinian dispossession. Just like the problem for the US is not that it has a strategic relationship with Israel. That's not the problem. The problem is the context where Israel is still in this unresolved conflict with the Palestinians in particular. And so it's the ongoing conflict, it's the ongoing dynamic of that conflict which throws up new settlement announcements, which throws up new provocations. I think that's what's problematic for the US, for the US-Israeli relationship.
Okay, we need to move this on.
To achieve.
Daniel, we need to move this on, but I just want to give Scott Carpenter an opportunity to respond to that, first of all.
Yeah, I disagree. I know it's important. I know it's critically important between the Israelis and the Palestinians to resolve this issue. But I don't think that Arab anti-American sentiment is reflected in behaviors that Arabs face. I mean, the number of protests in the region, the number of American boycotts of American products, the number of people not wanting to have visas to travel to the United States or to come and study in our universities. I just don't see the behavior. I look at the Iraqi elections. The issue of Israel and the Palestinians didn't feature once, even amongst the most Islamist of the Islamist parties. So I don't understand what the evidence is for this sentiment that somehow, unless we solve this, we can't
on this, Nick.
We can't do these other things.
Okay, Professor Fisher, what about this idea that Arab leadership is being undermined by the U.S. stance?
Well, two points. One, the anti-American sentiments are widely shared in the public. I agree that national governments behave mostly based on their national interest. However, the hostility of the public opinion towards the U.S. puts a considerable constraint on the ability of those friendly governments in the Middle East to cooperate with the U.S. Scott Carpenter, from State Department perspective, you would know that every time you ask Arab governments to do something, one of their major obsessions, if you want, is that we can't be seen too close to the U.S. And the only reason why they can't be seen too close to the U.S. is the imbalanced position of the American government. I'm not saying it is, as Danny said, it is not everything in the region, but it's the one conflict that has an impact on everything else, or that is being used as a formidable political tool as by Al-Qaeda and by some governments in order to justify policies that otherwise would not be sustainable in the region.
Daniel, sorry, I mean, Scott Carpenter, I do beg your pardon. I detect a swift drawing of breath there. What do you say to that?
I was just going to say it's not about the problem of the conflict itself. I agree. As I said, we all want peace and we all want this to go away. It would make our lives easier. But it's the linkage that bothers me. I've heard Egyptian government, for instance, link it to domestic and economic reform. We can't proceed on political reform until the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is solved. I've heard Saudi say we can't join with you to confront Iran, even though it's more of an existential threat to us than to Israel, unless you resolve the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. You don't hear that. Even King Abdullah and Prince Faisal the other day, when he said sanctions are not enough when talking about Iran. So clearly he wants more action now. He's not linking it or wanting to wait until the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is solved. So meanwhile, we have Iran, which is posing a major threat to the region, and we're, I would say, distracted by this conversation about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict setting the strategic context for everything we do. And
okay.
I just don't believe that's the case.
Okay, well, it is a conversation we're having nevertheless. And I'm going to bring in Daniel Levy in just a second. But just first, everyone's aware of the big Israeli lobby in the United States. A chance here perhaps to assess how united or galvanized that lobby may be. The perceived breakdown of relations between the two allies comes at the same time as a strong Israeli lobby appears perhaps to be weakening. Now, it's split between two major lobby groups, J Street and AIPAC. Now, J Street was created back in 2008, and it lobbies for a two-state solution for Israel and Palestine. It supports the Obama administration and believes in using diplomacy and talks to secure peace. And J Street was one of the few Israeli lobby groups to criticize Israel's latest plans to build new settlements in occupied East Jerusalem. AIPAC is much older than J Street. It was founded back in 1963, and aims to broaden and strengthen U.S.-Israeli relations. And it raises U.S. aid for Israel and works to develop what it calls anti-terrorist policies. Now, AIPAC put the onus on the Obama administration to diffuse the recent tensions with Israel, and it said that it should make a conscious effort to move away from public demands and unilateral deadlines directed at Israel. Daniel Levy, if we could come to you, what do you think? Is the lobby as strong as it ever was, or are there signs indeed of it weakening?
Lobbying is, as they say, as American as motherhood and apple pie. The American system is very much based on the role of organized advocacy groups or lobbies on this issue, and on many other issues. I think the thing that has happened in recent years, Nick, is that there has been an increasing discomfort that hadn't previously found a voice within the American Jewish community in terms of where Israel was going and where the Israel-US relationship was going. The American Jewish community is overwhelmingly liberal and Democrat. 78% supported President Obama, voted for him, and they felt that Israel was being too identified with neoconservative policies and with the right-wing Christian evangelical community and with the right wing of the Republican Party. And much of the Jewish community wanted, I think, to see a more pro-peace policy. They felt that was better for Israel, better for America, and if I may say, more in line with their Jewish values. And I think J Street, which as you say is the new kid on the block, has given voice to these values. There's a clear asymmetry. Both are pro-Israel, both support US aid, but one feels that America has to take much more of a leadership role and that Israel is urgently in need of ending this occupation and getting a two-state solution.
And there's something else, isn't there?
That's where we stand.
There's something else, isn't there? I read an article by the US analyst Mark Perry suggesting that the military's voice trumps that of the Israeli lobby in the White House. What do you think of that, Professor Fischer?
Well, I don't know about the Trump part of it. I don't think the question opposing the two lobbies in a dichotomy is useful. I think that the level of support to Israel in the US is unshakable, as Secretary Clinton said, and solid, but also that the support for Israel is much broader than the lobby or the lobbies that are actively working for this relationship. However, the assumption that supporting Israel requires backing any policy that the government of Israel takes is an essentially flawed assumption. I think it is important, and I think there are beginnings for this in the Jewish community in the US and indeed around the world to take more responsibility and to be more assertive in dealing with the government of Israel. Backing the government of Israel seems today less in need of direct backing by its friends than it is in need for advice, because you can win all the battles based on your support in the United States, the domestic politics argument. However, where is this taking you? Where is this taking Israel? How is this serving in the short run, in the mid run, in any term? How is this serving the security of Israel? If you manage to actually abort the two-state solution, if you manage, as Netanyahu seems to be on the verge of, to abort the establishment of a Palestinian state, what are you going to fall on? What's your fallback position?
Scott Carpenter in Washington, there does seem to be a growing perception that the US is incapable of standing up to Israel, doesn't there?
I would just point out that from Sharon to the next prime minister through to Netanyahu, the two-state solution is now part of Israeli policy, which it wasn't before. And it's very clearly part of Israeli policy. When Defense Minister Barak was in Washington last week, he spoke at the Institute where he made very clear that for Israel, it cannot be a Jewish state and a democratic state if it continues to own and occupy the West Bank. So when the defense minister is speaking like this, I think it reflects something that is burgeoning up inside Israel. There are lively debates inside Israel about this. The press has been as dismayed as Hillary Clinton was to learn of the announcement during Vice President Biden's trip of this expansion of the 1,600 homes in 3 years in this 43 acres. The point is not, I don't think that's the point. The point is, what should the United States do to pressure Israel to accept something that it is not ready to accept, or to put force on the Palestinians, for that matter, and a decision that they're not prepared to accept. We can use our good offices. We have a lot of power. We have the power to encourage, to nudge, and yes, to exert pressure when possible. But what's happened now, because of, I think, an overreaction, is we once again have violence in the streets of Jerusalem, and things have been very quiet of late.
Let's pass that curveball over to Daniel Levy. What should the United States do? What do you make of what Scott Carpenter has just said?
I think that's extremely problematic to describe what we saw in Jerusalem as having been caused by the Obama administration. I can't see where that comes from at all. Here's the problem. The problem is this huge disconnect between exactly what Mr. Carpenter said of what the Israeli defense minister articulated last week in Washington and the realities of what the Israeli government is pursuing on the ground. For over 40 years, we've created a situation where now more than 500,000 Israelis live beyond the green line. And that continues today. And Mr. Netanyahu says we're going to keep building in Jerusalem, the Jordan Valley will be Israel, etc. What does America do in that context? At the moment, we are still in the realm of just rhetoric. Now, in the past, some American administrations, the first Bush administration, moved from rhetoric to consequences and actions with the loan guarantees. That was an option used in the past. Other options have been to put plans on the table. A plan was put on the table by the Clinton administration. The roadmap was put forward by the Bush administration, which Israel had 14 objections to.
Listen, we're running out of time. I'm going to have to
look at rhetoric.
I'm sorry to jump in. I'm going to have to pass it over to Scott Carpenter. We've only got a couple of minutes left, and just give him an opportunity to respond to that.
I think that this is going to be a huge debate in the United States now. I think that the statements of Petraeus and this burgeoning crisis between the U.S. and Israel will have some sort of impact on the conflict on the ground. And what I fear is that we've escalated the rhetoric so much that no action will be able to match it. And that's my real concern, because when that happens, it always results in violence in the region. Because how can the Palestinians be less strong than the United States on these issues? How do they back down? This was the problem of the first year of the Obama administration. Saying to Netanyahu, no more settlements, and then backing down means Abu Mazen's legs have been cut out from under him. How does he come back to the table? And I think that this is essentially the problem. Count the costs. If you want to do this, do it, but count the costs. And I don't think the administration is doing it, and it's going to backfire for all of us.
Too much rhetoric, not enough action, Professor Fisher?
I think it boils down to this. If the U.S. wants to lead the two parties, or the parties in the region, broadly speaking, to peace, it has to push Israel and the Palestinians outside their comfort zone. The problem is, every time, in 75 with Kissinger, no less, in 91, in 79 with Egypt, every time the U.S. managed to lead and achieve something, it was at a time when it pushed Israel into places that Israel alone wouldn't go to. It doesn't mean those places are harmful to Israel. It just means that the machine in Israel alone will not lead Israel to these places. This is leadership. This is what the U.S. needs to do if it wants to push towards a solution.
Okay, I want to give the final word. I want to give the final word to Daniel Levy. You've got 30 seconds, sir.
What Izzadeen said. The internal political dynamic in Israel suggests today that Israel won't pull itself out of this on its own. It would be an act of friendship on the part of the United States, great for Israel, for the region, for Palestinians, if real choices were presented to the Israeli leadership, and I hope that's what we see happen.
Okay, interesting discussion, gentlemen. As ever, we've run out of time. We could go on for many hours talking about this. Very interesting. Thanks very much indeed for your perception, your perspectives on this.
Thank you.
Daniel Levy, Izzadeen Fisher, and Scott Carpenter, thanks very much indeed. And thank you so much for joining us here, for watching this edition of Inside Story. InsideStory@aljazeera.net is our email. From me, Nick Clark. Goodbye for now.